Hello, and welcome back to Film Fighter, the channel where we examine the strengths and weaknesses of different film cameras as if they were retro fighting game characters. In this episode, we check out the world of the big and chunky medium format SLRs, like this Mamiya 645. The goal of this channel is always to rate cameras for use by a photographer today, but it's useful to examine what factors led to these cameras becoming popular in the first place. Well, medium format cameras that shoot 120 roll film had been around for quite a while, at least since the 1920s and 30s, where twin lens reflex cameras like this Rolleiflex were very popular. The Rolleiflex kept its popularity up until about the 1960s. One of the big reasons for this is the large size of 120 roll film. Rolleiflex would shoot 60mm by 60mm negatives, significantly bigger than what we'd see with a small 35mm camera. But one of the potential drawbacks to the Rolleiflex is that it always shot things in a square aspect ratio. Now, while some people love the artistry of a square aspect ratio, professionals often realize that they would have to crop those photos to fit into a more standard-looking image. For example, if you were doing high school yearbook photos, you're throwing away film by shooting on square and having to crop down into a rectangle for yearbook photos, or senior portraits, or 8x10 images you'd hang on the wall, or newspaper layouts, all of which often defaulted to a rectangular 3:2 aspect ratio. So we could improve our economics if we just pre-cropped the image. This is one of the benefits of the 645 camera, which natively shoots a 3:2 aspect ratio, just like you'd see on 35mm film. And then instead of throwing away part of the image, you're able to get more shots per roll. One roll of 120 film in the Rolleiflex will get you 12 shots in a roll. But in the 645, all of those extra bits of film from our pre-cropping mean we can get 15 shots per roll on this camera. That difference is small, but sizable, as over time the economics really start to benefit heavy shooters like portrait or wedding photographers. And for this and many other reasons we'll see later, the style of SLR camera became incredibly popular for wedding and portrait photographers. Another big advantage is that you could get more exacting composition. On the twin lens reflex camera, you see what comes through this lens through your waist level finder, but the film sees what goes through this lens. When we're looking at far away subjects, these two lenses effectively see the same image. But as you move in close, this difference of a couple inches really can make a difference in your composition. Not so with single lens reflex cameras. On the SLR or single lens reflex style, the image and the film exposure come through the same lens. So the light would come through this lens and be diverted by a big 45-degree angle mirror up into this prism and then viewable by your eyepiece. When you go ahead and take a photo, the mirror flips out of the way and the light can go straight to the film in the back. This means that what you see is exactly what the film sees. Also, a prism like this one could rotate and flip the image so that you're seeing it right side up and left is on the left side, right on the right side. Again, not so with the Rolleiflex, where left and right are backwards. So there's a few big advantages to the SLR camera in general. All of these led to it becoming a very popular choice for quite a while. The other big advantage here is this really seemed to bridge the gap nicely between your larger medium formats and your 35mm smaller formats. So the Mamiya 645 offered great compromise for people today. Well, it did for people then, but is it a good compromise for us today? Let's start answering that question by looking at our first category, cost. When looking at cost, there's quite a different range of models of this style of camera. This particular camera is a Mamiya 645J model. The most common size or common model is the Mamiya 645 1000S. Those can be had with a 80mm f2.8 lens in good condition for around $500. Now, the cost of film is going to be a little bit more expensive than 35mm, but still cheaper than most medium format options. 100 shots of consumer-grade Kodak Gold 200 plus processing and scanning will cost about $164, or $1.64 per shot, which places it about average when compared to a wide variety of other film cameras. And that means we're going to score an overall decent 5 out of 10 when looking at cost. Next, we should examine this camera's collectability. These 645 cameras are rather recent in the world of film cameras and don't hold as much historical significance as you might see with older TLRs like a Rolleicord or Rolleiflex camera. Additionally, this was never meant to be an absolute top-of-the-line heirloom camera like competing medium format SLRs, particularly Hasselblads, were much more expensive then and still are much more sought after today. Today, this style of camera is most often purchased to be used rather than displayed. However, these are still well-made cameras from a major manufacturer, and they're likely to provide decent value if you do change your mind and want to resell them later. Again, the score here will be a rather average number, about a 5 out of 10 when we look at collectability and resale value. We'll see some other average scores in our next domain when we examine usability. Now, the Mamiya 645 cameras that we examine here appeared in a number of different models, all the way from the 1960s through the early 2000s. Many of these are what are called system cameras, which have different interchangeable parts that could be used to provide efficient configurations for various users. Later models added more features like aperture priority, and the latest ones even having autofocus, which would make it easier to shoot. But this model, the Mamiya 645J, is at the very bottom of the Mamiya line in terms of its usability features. It's a little bit harder to use, and that difficulty starts when we look at loading the film. So let's take a look at loading the film on this Mamiya 645 camera. The film is going to be located in the back. To access it, I have to take this button and slide it in the direction of the arrow. So I'm going to slide it to the right. But you'll notice it doesn't go anywhere. There's a little trick to these. I have to push down this part, which is normally used to hold a film identifier. So I push this out, then move to the side, and it just pops right up and open. Once it's open, you can see this 120 magazine here. So I pinch in the middle and pull out the magazine. The magazine is what's actually going to hold the film. This is quite a useful tool when we compare it to twin lens reflex cameras like the Rolleicord from before. The idea is you could preload many of these magazines, and if you were going to, say, shoot a wedding, you'd finish one roll, take it out, take a fresh magazine, and just plug that right back into the camera. It's allowed for quick reloads so long as you preloaded all of your film and had multiple magazines. Today, I would argue that unless you're doing weddings or other fast-paced shoots, that might not be the best approach. But for me, I'm just content with a single magazine. So I want to load the magazine, and this can be a little confusing as well. If we want more information, we can though look at a diagram drawn on the back. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to flip these tabs to open up both of the spool compartments and pull out the old used spool. We see on our picture that we're going to take the new film and point it here, rolling over this way, coming around the film plate and back onto the take-up spool at the bottom. The actual image area is going to be defined by this. So here's the pressure plate that keeps the film pushed up against the camera, and this is roughly the area of our exposure. So I need a take-up spool. I'm going to take that and put it on the bottom. I'll push the right side in first until it lines up and pops in like that. And then I move this tab up. So now the spool is securely in place and can be turned in one direction, but not in the other. Then I'm going to take my roll of film, this one just being a set of backing paper from a previously used roll. On Ilford black and white rolls, you're going to see a white side that says unexposed when you have a new set of film, and when we're all done, it would look black. Just like before, I'm going to pop it in on the right side first and make sure everything is sitting nice. And there we go. Then I'm going to pop on the left tab, and now I can see my film. But that's not quite the way that they want it. They want the film this way, and then rolling over from the back side. Okay, well, we can do that. Loaded. And now we're following the diagram. I take the backing paper around, under the pressure plate, and feed it into the slot on the take-up spool. And then I'll rotate the take-up spool, keeping this nice and tight, and I'll keep moving the film until I get my arrow. This arrow here should line up with this start mark on the side. So that's lined up quite well. It's nice and tight. And all I would do now is I take this and I pop it right into the back of the camera. You can push it in, hear a click, close the back, and now we're ready to shoot. After we've taken a shot, we're going to go ahead and advance using this wheel. Here's our button to actually take the shot. So before we take a shot, we've got to make sure we're at the first frame. If we were to take a shot now, we would end up just exposing the backing paper rather than actually exposing the frame itself. So I'm going to wind the camera until we're off the S, past all these arrows, and onto frame 1, and we can feel it lock in place. I'll then fold that back down, and I could take my first exposure. Once the exposure is taken, I'll then wind ahead to frame 2, and again, we'll feel it lock into place. Take the exposure. If you want, you can use the winder, and it locks in place on frame 3. So there's a real nice positive stop every time that we advance the frame. We'll go ahead and advance all the way to the end of the roll, and I'll show you how to take it out. When we're at our 15th frame here, I'll advance this to the final frame, I'll take the picture, and then when I continue to turn, we'll see that it doesn't actually lock in place. You'll hear and feel a spot where it wants to lock in place, but then just keeps going. I'm going to continue winding until the film is all on the spool, and I can usually feel that. If it does lock into place, we can always trigger an exposure, but it's just not going to be exposing anything at this point. So once it's moving freely, I'll go ahead and I'll open up the back. Same trick as before, push this in, move over, and I should see my exposed film on the bottom. We can take out the magazine, and then to get the exposed film out, move this tab, take your exposed film, now labeled as exposed and on Ilford with a different color, and I'll either lick this side and stick it to the paper, or I'll use tape or a rubber band to keep this secure and send off to a lab, or develop it yourself. So that's how we load film in the Mamiya 645. Now once the film is loaded, you can use the onboard metered prism to calculate exposure through the lens. This sounds like a great tool, but it's much more difficult here than it is on, say, a 1970s SLR camera. In order to use the metered prism, I first need to take the shutter speed wheel and move it to the red dot. This tells the camera that it's in metering mode rather than in a taking mode. I also need to turn this dial to flip the meter to the on position. Now the battery in the meter starts actively taking readings. Once that's done, I'll look through the camera in order to evaluate the needle, which you'll find on the top of the viewfinder. To calibrate the ISO for the needle sensitivity, there's a little wheel here, which I'll turn in order to set the ASA. ASA, by the way, exactly the same in terms of value as ISO. ISO is just the more modern term for International Standards Organization, instead of the kind of American-based ASA standard. After this is done, and I've established my reading, I now have to go back to the shutter speed dial and change it. You will not see changes from the dials reflected in the meter while you're looking. This does slow you down a little bit in process, so I have to flip the camera to metering position, take a reading, readjust everything in order to put it in taking position, and then go ahead and press the button to take the exposure. Now, when it comes to focusing, this camera does have a rather nice split image rangefinder where I can nail focus quite well, but it's manual focus only. Not as fast as other things, but definitely as good as I would expect from any of the film cameras. All in all, this is a relatively easy process. It's certainly more involved than a more modern camera, and much more difficult than, say, a point and shoot or a modern DSLR or mirrorless camera set on a semi-automatic mode. However, it's relatively easy, especially for medium format cameras. Not much more challenging than using a camera that only shoots in manual mode, such as a Nikon FM or Minolta SRT series. Overall, I'd say the usability for this camera is an average score of 5 out of 10. This very balanced trend continues in the category of flexibility. Now, when it comes to analyzing the flexibility of this camera, we need to be honest about what this was made for. The Mamiya 645 was never intended for genres like action, sports, or wildlife. But in genres like portraiture, landscapes, or weddings, it's very well suited to the task. The camera has interchangeable lenses and can be used for a fairly wide variety of focal lengths, all the way from rather wide things, roughly equivalent to a 24mm field of view, to rather telephoto, something equivalent to about a 100 or 135mm field of view. This again is well suited for this camera's intended purposes. Things like weddings or senior photos are a great opportunity to use the camera. But when it comes to things like travel or street photography, the size really holds it back. So I would give this a balanced score of 5 out of 10. The things that it's designed for, it's very good at. The things it's not designed for, it's not so good at. What more could you expect from any camera? So far then, the Mamiya has extraordinarily well-balanced conditions, even though it's rather average in all of these categories. But in our last few categories, we're going to look at some areas where it performs below expectations. A big one here is its size. By their very nature, medium format cameras are almost always going to be larger than similarly equipped 35mm cameras. They have to have larger lenses in order to expose larger pieces of film at the back. And those larger lenses need more length in order to cast that image circle. This adds weight, it adds complexity, and it definitely makes these harder to carry. Even for me, as somebody who's 6'3" and relatively young and strong, I find this to be just too big for most situations, unless I have a specific plan or shooting need. If I'm going to a session to take photos of friends that they want to have on film, this might be a good choice. But if I'm just walking around a city looking for interesting opportunities, it's not the camera that I'm going to bring very often. So our score here is a rather poor 3 out of 10. The last category where the Mamiya 645 underperforms is its reliability. The Mamiya 645 is a heavy, well-made, robust camera with almost all metal construction in the Mamiya 645J, the original M645, and the Mamiya 645 1000S. There are later models that have lots of plastic, and for these cameras that are pushing 50 years old, I personally steer clear of the plastic cameras. Because of the degradation of plastic over time, they're going to become more brittle. But regardless of which Mamiya 645 model you pick, they all have some potential points of failure. One of them is the fact that they're electronically controlled shutters, which means at some point with 50-year-old cameras, we're running the risk that that electric component fails and the shutter does not work. These cameras don't have a mechanical backup to fire the shutter at, say, at 1/30th, which was a common approach. So if the electronics fail, this camera is useless. You're going to want to have a backup camera with you if you're taking it to a serious shoot. And anytime we have a battery-controlled camera, we run the risk of the battery running out in the middle of a shoot. Again, it means you have to have a backup ready. None of these things mean it's a bad camera. I expect this to continue working well for decades. But in the middle of a shoot, the chance that a battery fails or electronic component fails is much higher than it is with some other film cameras. And I'm going to score this a slightly below average 4 out of 10 in the reliability. Finally, let's look at the most important category for many of us, image quality. As we've said many times on this channel, any camera is capable of producing stunning, artistic images. But the Mamiya 645 was really designed with image quality as a top priority. And we see that when we begin to look at the potential images that can be pulled out from this camera. The 6 by 4.5 centimeter negative is not as large as the 6 by 6 that we get from our vintage Rolleiflexes or Rolleicords, but it's still a significant improvement from the 35 millimeter negative. It's going to provide smoother tones, higher resolution, and less apparent grain than you're going to see with 35 millimeter. Additionally, the lenses that I can place on this camera are much more modern in their design and in their lens coatings. Particularly the newest line of lenses, the N lenses, offer exceptional sharpness for the film era. They also control nicely for flare, and if bokeh is your thing, then the 80mm f1.9 lens can yield stunning out-of-focus backgrounds, equivalent to roughly a f1.1 or 1.2 on a modern full-frame camera. Now, I don't have that lens. In fact, the only lens you're going to see is this normal 80mm f2.8. So let's have a look at some of the images that I've been able to capture over the last year with this camera and the 80mm 2.8 lens. While I don't love these photos as much as I've loved other galleries that I've created with different cameras, I have to confess the sample size here is relatively small. I've only shot 4 reels of film through this, enough for me to feel confident in the general statements of my review, but not nearly enough to get the best out of this camera. Still, I've been able to notice some real significant advantages that this has over our older medium format Rolleicord. The Mamiya 645 lenses are much better at dealing with flare and are much better at creating out-of-focus bokeh-style backgrounds. I also find it much easier to compose in the rectangular aspect ratio than I do the square aspect ratio from the Rolleicord or Rolleiflex. And I greatly prefer being able to put my eye right up to the camera instead of having to use the waist-level viewfinder from the Rolleicord. When it comes to grading image quality, I have to say that the Mamiya 645 is going to score an impressive 7.5 out of 10. The bump in resolution over 35mm is noticeable, and the quality of the lenses is significantly better than what I saw with my older Rolleicord. So, how does this work overall? let's look at our conclusions for the Mamiya 645J. So where does this leave us with rating the camera overall? Well, let's begin by looking at a radar chart. The Mamiya 645 is a rather well-balanced camera with no truly low marks. Its weakest score is its size, but depending on your use case, that may not be an issue. Overall, I find that the 645 strikes a balance between those who want good image quality and those who want to carry their camera around instead of being tied to a tripod. If you were going to shoot exclusively medium format film, this may be a good choice, as it's less expensive and the lenses are smaller and sharper than many other medium format options. However, it's still a slow shooter and has all of the inherent compromises that come with medium format. People who only shoot medium format occasionally may want to lean into the strengths of medium format and look at a larger camera that has even better potential image quality. If that sounds like you may want to consider the Mamiya RB67, which is quite a bit larger, but shoots an impressive 6x7cm negative. And if you want a medium format camera that has more tools to help you get the shot, then you might want to consider more modern versions of the Mamiya 645J, such as the Mamiya 645E, 645 Super, or even the autofocusing 645AF. All of those are excellent cameras, but they come at a significantly higher cost, and the additional usability and features they have are more prone to failure. Every time we add complexity, we make it less reliable. Of course, if you like the older manual focus cameras like this, but you want a different brand, you could try the Bronica ETRS or the Pentax 645. And if money is no object, you could try the Contax 645 system. All of these cameras can produce exceptional images, but they have the same inherent advantages and disadvantages of the Mamiya 645J that we looked at today. So how does this camera fit my needs? Well, I can see how this form factor got to be so popular in its day. The image quality I find to be a significant step up from 35mm, and I find that I get better results when I have the ability to look at and compose through an eyepiece accurately instead of making some guesstimates off of the waist level finder. I also find that the faster lenses and the better shutter speeds give me much more exposure latitude than I have with the vintage Rolleicord. Given the right situation, this is a great tool. I often find myself reaching for this if I'm going to do a family portrait shoot or a senior photo shoot where I know that I want to take pictures of relatively slow-moving modeling-type subjects. So, if I want to work at a reasonably fast pace, this is a good choice. If I was only allowed to use one medium format camera, this would be a strong contender. But medium format isn't always the right choice. If I only had one camera, this wouldn't be it. If I had to pick just a single film camera, I might go with next week's contender. Next week, we're going to examine SLR cameras in the 35mm form factor, which came out during the golden age of film photography, from about 1960 through about the mid-1980s. My choice for that style of camera is the Nikon FM, an excellent camera that we're going to look at in next week's episode. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Film Fighter, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Until then, have a great week, and remember that every camera is a compromise. So go out and take pictures with whatever you have.